That April 1945. In a small room, an OSS agent raises a weird-looking tube and fires. No bang, no flash, no hot shell casing on the floor. This is the Invisible SAC-46 dart pistol, built to kill without sound or flash. A gun that doesn't shoot bullets. It shoots a tiny dart pushed by CO2 gas, like a cruel air tool made for war. Only around 15 were ever built, because this wasn't for a battlefield. It was for the quiet war, sentries, hallways, stairwells, and faces you're not supposed to meet. But here's the twist. A silent shot is not the same as a stopping shot. If the dart doesn't drop a man fast, he can still shout. He can still fire back. He can still ruin the mission in 1 second. So why did the OSS chase this invisible pistol anyway? And what secret problem made it disappear before anyone could even prove it worked? November 1944. A narrow street in occupied Paris. Fog rolls between the buildings like something alive, clinging to wet cobblestones, softening every footstep, swallowing voices before they can travel far. A man in a dark coat stands in a doorway. He is not French. A uniform hides under civilian clothes, but the way he holds himself, shoulders locked, eyes always moving, marks him as Gestapo. Beside him walks a local collaborator, smoking and laughing about something that happened earlier that day. They do not know they are being watched. Across the street, in the shadow of a shuttered cafe, another man waits. Calm, still. Breathing measured, like he is counting seconds in his head. One hand rests inside his coat, fingers wrapped around something that does not feel like a pistol. It's too light, too long. The grip is wrong, more like a pipe with a handle bolted onto it than a proper weapon. He steps out. The collaborator turns, their eyes meet. The weapon rises, no muzzle flash, no sharp crack ripping through the night, no brass casing spinning away to ping off stone. Just a soft hiss, like air slipping out of a tire, or a man letting out a breath through his teeth. The dart is already gone. It's small, red, plastic, thin as a sewing needle. It moves slow enough that, in daylight, you might actually see it travel. But here, in the fog, in the dark, it is invisible until it strikes. The collaborator grabs his neck, not screaming, not even fully understanding. His face shows confusion first, like he's been stung, like the world has suddenly changed rules. He pulls the dart free, stares at it, tries to speak, and then his knees fold. The Gestapo officer shouts and reaches for his sidearm, but the man who fired is already slipping backward into the shadows, the strange weapon hidden under his coat. No blast, no flash, no casing left behind for Germans to find, pocket, and trace. Just a body on wet stones, and a tiny red dart lying in the gutter. This is the SAC-46, codename Flying Dragon. It is not a gun in the normal sense, no. Gunpowder, no bullets. It is an air-powered dart pistol, driven by a carbon dioxide cartridge mounted under the barrel, built to launch a poison-tipped dart in near-total silence. It was built by the Office of Strategic Services between 1943 and 1945. Only around 15 units were ever produced. Almost nobody outside a locked briefing room ever saw one, let alone carried it. Because this weapon was never meant for open combat. It wasn't designed to cut down squads. It was designed to kill one person, quietly, invisibly, without waking the guard in the next room. It was built for the kind of war that happens in hallways, in stairwells, in occupied cities, in the space between a resistance fighter's coat and a collaborator's skull. But from the start, one problem haunted the Flying Dragon. Silence is not the same thing as lethality. A dart pushed by compressed gas does not hit like a bullet. It won't smash bone. It won't rip through the body with raw force. In simple terms, it's a puncture, small, sharp, and clean. And if that puncture doesn't deliver enough poison, fast enough to shut the body down before the target can react, then the silence means nothing. He can still shout. He can still raise the alarm. He can still spin and fire back. And in that moment, the mission dies. So, the OSS wasn't just building a quiet weapon. They were building a weapon that depended on chemistry, on a poison that could turn a pinprick into a death sentence before the target even understood what had happened. This was not a tool for soldiers. It was a tool for assassins. And that raised a question no amount of machining could solve. What kind of poison works fast enough to justify the risk? If this story feels as strange and unsettling as it should, a quick subscribe helps the channel keep digging into the weapons, missions, and choices that never made it into the textbooks. Now, let's talk about why the OSS wanted this nightmare in the first place. The problem facing American intelligence in 1943 was harshly simple. You cannot win a secret war with loud weapons. By the time the Office of Strategic Services was formed in 1942, war in occupied Europe had split into two different fights. There was the war everyone could see, tanks grinding across fields, bombers filling the sky, infantry clashing in the open. That war had rules, it had front lines, it had uniforms. And then there was the other war, the war in basements, in back alleys, in cramped apartments where resistance cells printed forged papers and hid Allied pilots, in factories where saboteurs loosened bolts on Nazi machines, in cafes where collaborators met their handlers, never noticing the stranger 3 tables away who was memorizing faces. This was the war the OSS was built to fight, and in this war, a single gunshot could erase months of work in one heartbeat. Picture the math of a typical covert job in occupied France. A resistance team gets word that a high-value target, a Gestapo officer, a collaborator, a known informant, will be at a specific place at a specific time. The goal is simple: remove him before he passes information to the Germans, or before he can point out local resistance members to the SS. In practice, the team has 3 options. First, a knife. Yes, it can be silent, but a knife demands contact. It demands strength. It demands luck. The target has to be alone, unaware, and unable to fight back. A knife means grappling. It means bodies pressed together in the dark. It means blood and hands slipping. It means the chance the target screams, or that the struggle thumps through a wall. And if there are guards nearby, or if the target is stronger than expected, the mission ends with the resistance fighter dead or captured. Second, a conventional pistol. A normal sidearm is reliable, but it's also a signal flare for every enemy within range. A standard 9mm or 45 ACP shot can hit around 160 decibels, about like standing near a jet engine at takeoff. Even with a suppressor, the shot can still be heard through doors, down halls, across courtyards. Then comes the muzzle flash, a bright blink in the dark that pulls every eye toward the shooter. Worse, there's the shell casing. Hot brass flips out, lands on the floor, and sits there like a calling card, stamped with markings that can be traced back through a maker, a shipment, a supply chain. That's physical evidence left at the scene of a killing. Third, the old methods, crossbows, garrots. Poison slipped into food or drink. They can be quiet, yes, but they come with their own traps. A crossbow takes skill and time to reload. A garrote demands the same close-range danger as a knife, just slower and uglier. Poison demands access. Someone has to get near the target's plate or cup. That usually means relying on other people, waiters, cooks, intermediaries. And every extra person in that chain is another weak link, another mouth that might talk under pressure, another name that can be beaten out of someone in an interrogation room. None of these choices are clean. All of them carry brutal risk in missions where the margin of error is basically 0. So, the OSS stops thinking like soldiers. They stop measuring success by firepower, by range, by how many rounds fit in a magazine. They start thinking like intelligence officers, people who live and die on what stays hidden, people who need a kill to look like nothing happened. They ask a different set of questions. What if you could kill someone without a sound loud enough to carry through a door? What if there was no muzzle flash to betray the shooter's position? What if there was no hot brass on the floor, no easy clue for investigators to scoop up? What if there was no gunpowder residue on hands, clothes, or skin? What if the weapon itself was so odd that even if an enemy found it, he wouldn't recognize it as a firearm right away? This is where the Flying Dragon begins, not as a dream of battlefield dominance, not as a smarter rifle or a better machine gun. It's built for a narrow, ugly purpose: remove a single human being in a crowded, occupied city, without alerting anyone within earshot that a killing just happened. The OSS wants a weapon that can be fired in a hallway while guards sleep 2 doors down. A weapon that can be used in a packed Paris cafe without causing panic. A weapon that leaves almost nothing behind except a body, and even then, a body that might not look murdered at first glance. They need a gun that does not behave like a gun. So, they stop thinking like gun makers, and they start thinking like airgun tinkerers, because the answer is not more gunpowder, or a better suppressor, or a smaller cartridge. The answer comes from walking away from combustion entirely. The solution is pneumatic. The solution is pneumatic. That means the weapon that comes out of OSS workshops between 1943 and 1945 looks nothing like what most people picture when they hear the word pistol. There's no sleek shape, no polished steel, no comfortable grip made for a trained hand. The SAC-46, officially labeled that way and unofficially nicknamed the Flying Dragon, looks like something built in a garage by someone who barely cares what a real handgun is supposed to look like. And in a way, that's exactly what it is. The frame is crude, rough metal tubing welded into a skeleton. The barrel is long, almost absurdly long for something meant to hide under a coat. But that length has a reason. The dart needs time to steady itself in flight, and the longer tube also gives the gas more time to push and accelerate the dart before it leaves the muzzle. Under the barrel, mounted side by side, sits a small carbon dioxide cartridge, the kind you'd expect in soda fountains or commercial refrigeration. Nothing exotic, nothing that looks like ammo at a glance. But here it becomes the propellant, the replacement for gunpowder, an invisible push that can launch a dart with no flame, no blast, and none of the chemical stink of a normal firearm. The trigger system is simple, almost primitive. Pull the trigger and a valve opens. Pressurized carbon dioxide rushes into a sealed space behind the dart. The gas expands, the dart moves, no explosion, no combustion. Just pressure doing what pressure always does. And then there's the dart, the strangest part of the entire design. It's red, plastic, thin as a hypodermic needle, with a small fin at the base to help it fly straight. The tip is hollow, meant to carry a liquid payload. This is not a bullet built to do damage by impact and tearing. It's a delivery system, a chemical weapon disguised as a tiny projectile. The whole assembly weighs almost nothing. It looks fragile. It looks like a toy, like something a kid might throw together from scrap metal and spare parts. But it is not a toy. This weapon is born in a very specific window, 1943 to 1945. The brutal middle to late stretch of the Second World War, the period when the OSS is hunting for tools to support resistance work in Nazi-occupied Europe and to push special operations in the Pacific. The moment when normal gun design stops being enough because covert war has different rules. Only around 15 units are ever made, not 15,000, not 1,500. 15, that number matters. It tells you this was never meant for mass issue. It wasn't built for whole units, and it wasn't meant to be passed around like a standard sidearm. It's a specialty tool, made for very specific jobs, handed only to operatives who understand both what it can do and what it can't. The Flying Dragon is a proof of concept, an experiment in lethality wrapped in silence. A question asked in metal and gas. Can we make death invisible? And for a brief moment, it looks like the answer might be yes. The weapon produces almost no sound. Later testing would put it around 69 decibels, quieter than normal conversation, and not much louder than a low voice in a quiet room. There's no muzzle flash to light up a dark corridor, no shell casing to clatter on the floor, no obvious ballistic trail to follow back to the shooter. The carbon dioxide cartridge can be replaced quickly, even though the weapon itself is single shot and must be reloaded by hand after every dart. On paper, it's perfect. A weapon that can slide past checkpoints because it doesn't look like a weapon. A weapon that can be fired in a hotel hallway without waking the guests. A weapon that leaves almost no trace, no gunpowder residue, no rifling marks on a bullet, no clean forensic link between a body and a specific firearm. It seems like the ideal answer to the OSS problem, until you ask what the weapon actually needs in order to work, because the Flying Dragon is not built to kill by impact. A dart pushed by compressed gas doesn't have the speed to drive deep. It doesn't have enough force to shatter bone or tear through a rib cage. At close range, it might punch through clothing and skin, might sink a few millimeters into flesh. But that wound by itself is survivable. The dart is not the weapon. The poison is the weapon. The dart is only the delivery system, a syringe with a trigger, a hypodermic launched across a room instead of pressed into skin. And that creates a dependency no amount of clever machining can remove. If the poison fails, if it acts too slowly, if the dose is too small, if the target has an unexpected tolerance, or if the dart hits at a bad angle and doesn't release its payload, then the whole weapon fails. And in covert operations, failure is not counted in missed shots or wasted ammunition. Failure is counted in captured operatives, in blown networks, in resistance cells exposed, rolled up, and executed. So, the success of the Flying Dragon depends entirely on chemistry, on toxicology, on questions that can't be answered in a workshop or on a firing range. Now the weapon's success depends on chemistry, not aim. Now the weapon's success depends on chemistry, not aim. And that is where the Flying Dragon stops being a clean engineering problem and becomes something harder, something darker. Because the question facing the Office of Strategic Services researchers is not, can we build a silent weapon? They've already solved that. The device exists, it fires, it stays quiet, the mechanics behave. The real question is colder. What do we put inside the dart that can stop a human being before he can raise the alarm? This is not a thought experiment. This is operational need, framed in the most brutal terms. A resistance fighter gets one chance, one shot, one dart. If the target does not go down, quickly, quietly, completely, the mission is compromised. The fighter is exposed. And in occupied Europe, exposure means torture, interrogation, and a firing squad. So the poison has to be fast, not fast as in minutes, not even fast as in half a minute. Fast as in the time it takes a man to draw one breath, to shout one warning, to reach for a sidearm. Ideally, the target collapses in seconds, dead within a minute or two. But it also has to be reliable. A poison that works on some people but not others is a gamble, not a tool. A poison that needs a perfect injection point, hitting a vein, avoiding muscle, doesn't match reality when a dart is launched across a dark room at a moving target. A poison that breaks down in storage or becomes useless when exposed to air or needs refrigeration cannot be carried for weeks in hostile territory by an operative living out of a pocket and a suitcase. And this is where the Office of Strategic Services hits the wall, because the poisons that act quickly enough to matter are, in most cases, hard to handle, unstable, or easy to spot after the fact. Some fast-acting toxins can leave clear traces and recognizable symptoms for a trained medical examiner. Other categories can be effective but dangerously volatile, dangerous to store, dangerous to transport, and dangerous to the user if anything leaks, breaks, or goes wrong. And the slower options, plant toxins, heavy metal compounds, bacterial agents, may be harder to confirm quickly, but they defeat the whole point. If the target has time to understand he's been attacked, time to call for help, time to describe the attacker, then the silence of the weapon becomes meaningless. This is the paradox at the heart of the Flying Dragon. You need a poison that works like a light switch, instant, binary, alive, then not. But chemistry doesn't behave like a switch, and the human body isn't a machine that shuts down on command. Toxins need time to spread, time to move through tissue and blood, time to bind, time to disrupt the nervous system or the heart enough to cause collapse, and time is the one resource a covert operation never has. So, the Office of Strategic Services experiments. They test compounds. They consult chemists, doctors, and toxicologists who understand how substances move through flesh and bloodstream. They study older records, poisons used by assassins in other eras, and methods rumored or reported in other intelligence circles. They consider everything from rare plant extracts to synthetic agents that only laboratories can make. But no perfect answer appears, and this point matters. The Flying Dragon is not pushed aside because the tube doesn't work. It's pushed aside, more accurately sidelined, because the poison problem can't be solved in a way the operators can trust with their lives. This is not a battlefield gun. This is not a backup tool. If you deploy the Flying Dragon, it's because the mission demands absolute silence, absolute invisibility. It's because failure means death, not just for you, but for everyone connected to your network. So, the weapon cannot be mostly reliable. It cannot be good enough. It must work every single time, or it becomes worse than useless, because it gives the operator false confidence. It makes him believe he's carrying certainty, when he's really carrying a gamble shaped like a weapon. That is the moral weight built into the Flying Dragon's design. It is made for close-range killing, for assassination, not combat, for eliminating sentries, collaborators, informants, human beings who may or may not be armed, who may or may not be guilty of more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It is a weapon that forces closeness. You see the target's face. You read his expression. You make a decision in the last second before you pull the trigger, and there is no undo button because there is no second shot, no quick correction, no clean way to fix a mistake. Worse, if it fails, it leaves the operator standing there with a strange metal tube in his hands, while the target is still alive. Now the target is aware. Now he can shout. Now he can run. Now he can pull a gun. The Flying Dragon isn't designed for war in the traditional sense. It's designed for the quiet war, the shadow war, the kind of war where the person doing the killing has to live with it, because the act is so intimate, so personal, that there is no distance between what you do and what it does to your conscience. And that is a burden no amount of engineering can machine away. And that is a burden no amount of engineering can eliminate. But war does not pause for moral debate. And by early 1945, the Office of Strategic Services is no longer arguing about whether the Flying Dragon should exist. They are reacting to urgent needs coming from the field. The timeline shifts. What began as experiments, sketches on drafting tables, prototypes tested in controlled rooms, careful debates about what might go inside the dart, turns into a rush to build real hardware for real missions. The exact details are still partly locked away even today. Names of operatives were protected by deliberate record destruction. Mission labels are blacked out. Locations are blurred. But one hard fact remains. In February 1945, someone in the field asks for the Flying Dragon by name, not a suppressed pistol, not a normal weapon with a homemade silencer. They request the pneumatic dart gun. That single request tells you everything. It means someone, somewhere, has a mission so sensitive, so dependent on absolute silence, that they are willing to bet their life on an experimental tool that has never been proven in real operations. This is the line of no return. Up to this point, the Flying Dragon lives in the abstract, a proof of concept, a maybe, waiting for the perfect set of conditions. Something that might be useful one day, in the right hands, in the right hallway. Now it's being pulled out of the workshop and pushed toward the field, into occupied territory, into the coat of an operative, into a situation where one mistake is not a report. It's a death sentence. The Office of Strategic Services responds. Production speeds up. The first batch of operational units is assembled and readied for delivery. Darts are manufactured, carbon dioxide cartridges are gathered. Whatever poison has been chosen, assuming one has been chosen at all, is placed into hollow tips under strict secrecy, and then the weapon disappears into the covert supply chain. That's how these operations work. A request appears. A tool is prepared. It gets handed to a courier, then another, until it reaches the person who asked for it. Nobody asks for details. Nobody writes the target's name on paper. Nobody says the location out loud. The object just moves from point A to point B, and then it vanishes into the shadows where these wars are fought. We do not know if that first operational Flying Dragon was ever fired in anger. We do not know if it worked. We do not know if the operative who carried it survived the war, or if the weapon was lost, captured, or destroyed to keep it out of enemy hands. What we do know is that more units are made. By the spring of 1945, roughly 15 SAC-46 pistols exist. More darts, hundreds, possibly over 1,000, are prepared and held in Office of Strategic Services inventory. The weapon is real, it can be issued, and someone inside the system believes it is worth the risk. But here is the brutal arithmetic of timing. It is April 1945. In Europe, the Third Reich is breaking apart. Allied forces are closing in on Berlin from both directions. Occupied cities are being freed. Resistance networks that lived in whispers for years are stepping into daylight, joining regular units, shifting from guerrilla survival to open combat and arrests. In the Pacific, the island campaign continues, but the end is no longer a mystery. Japan is being pushed back, and the final phase is visible on the horizon, and that means the operational window for a weapon like the Flying Dragon is already closing. Because this device was built for a very specific war, the war of occupation, the war of clandestine jobs in enemy-controlled cities, the war of high-risk killings where silence is more valuable than firepower. But as the Allies advance, street by street, city by city, the need for this kind of tool shrinks. A dart gun makes sense in occupied Paris, when a resistance fighter needs to remove a Gestapo officer without waking guards stationed 2 doors down. It makes less sense when the city is in Allied hands and the Gestapo is dead, captured, or running east. So the first batch is rushed out, sent to operatives who asked for it, or held in reserve for missions that may never happen. But the clock is already running. Will it save a mission? Will it prove itself in the field, showing that years of work were worth it? Or will it fail at the worst possible second, leaving an operative exposed, a target still standing and screaming, a network blown because the poison acted too slowly, or because the dart struck wrong, or because the weapon hesitated when it had to be perfect? The answer to that will decide what the Flying Dragon becomes. A legendary covert tool, whispered about inside intelligence circles, refined after the war, improved by the next generation. Or a footnote, a curiosity, a weapon that existed briefly, then vanished, remembered only by the small handful of people who knew it was ever real. And the clock is ticking. Because in less than 3 months, the war in Europe will be over. Because in less than 3 months, the war in Europe will be over. But before we can understand why the Flying Dragon fades into obscurity, we have to understand how it actually works, not in vague spy brief language, not in the tone of a locked report. We need to pull it apart, piece by piece, until the limitations become impossible to ignore. Strip away the mystery, and the SAC-46 is almost bluntly simple. At its core, it's a pneumatic launcher, a tube with a valve, the kind of basic idea you might see in a nail gun, a paint sprayer, or even a livestock injector. There's no magic here, no miracle trick, just compressed gas doing what it always does, rushing from high pressure to low pressure, and pushing something forward when it gets the chance. A carbon dioxide. Cartridge sits beneath the barrel, locked into a housing that keeps it sealed until firing. When the trigger is pulled, a striker punctures the cartridge seal. Gas floods into the system, and pressure builds behind the dart. For a brief moment, less than a blink, the chamber fills. Then the valve opens. Pressure becomes motion. No flame, no spark, no burning powder, no heat flash lighting up a hallway. Just controlled pressure, released on command. The dart itself weighs almost nothing, only a few grams at most. And it sits in the barrel with a tight seal, because if gas leaks around it instead of staying behind it, the weapon loses what little power it has. That seal is everything, which means the dart has to fit precisely, which means loading is not casual. You can't just drop a dart in and hope. You have to seat it carefully so the base forms an airtight connection. You check the cartridge, you check the valve, you make sure the striker is ready. And once you fire, you do it all again. This is a single-shot weapon, not semi-automatic, not bolt action. One dart, one trigger pull, and you're done until you reload by hand. In a real scenario, that means you get one clean chance, one dart, one attempt to hit a spot where the poison can actually do its job. If you miss, if the target moves at the last instant, if the dart strikes at a bad angle, if it catches fabric and fails to bite into skin, you are now standing there with an empty tube, in a room with someone who understands you just tried to kill them. And reloading under pressure is not a range problem, it's a human problem. Adrenaline hits, hands shake, vision narrows, seconds feel like knife blades. You have to deal with the cartridge, either keep it if it still has pressure, or swap it if it's spent or unreliable. You have to pull a fresh dart from wherever you hit it, a pocket, a pouch, a concealed container that won't crush these fragile plastic projectiles. Then you have to seat it properly again, even though your brain is screaming that you don't have time. This is not a weapon designed for a firefight. It's designed for a world where the plan is perfect. The target is alone, unaware, and close. You have time to aim, time to breathe, time to make the shot clean. But war does not care about perfect plans. And the dart itself adds another problem: speed. The dart moves slowly compared to a bullet. Testing suggests a muzzle velocity around 350 feet per second, roughly 100 meters per second, while many handgun and rifle rounds can travel hundreds to over 1,000 meters per second, depending on the load. And because the dart is so light, air pushes it around more than it would push a dense lead projectile. Across a room or down a hallway, that might not matter much. But after only a few meters, the dart starts bleeding speed. It starts drifting. A small breeze matters. Gravity pulls it down more noticeably than it would pull a normal round, which means accuracy becomes a gamble, not a promise. And here's the part no amount of training can fully solve. The dart must penetrate skin and deliver its payload. If it hits heavy clothing, a coat, a uniform jacket, layered fabric, it may not have enough energy to push through. It can bounce or stick in cloth without ever reaching flesh. If it hits bone, a rib, a skull, the hard ridge of a shoulder, it won't penetrate. It won't deliver the poison. The target will feel a sharp sting, look down, and see a strange red object caught in his clothing. And then he understands. Someone just tried to kill him. In that moment, silence stops mattering. A silent weapon that cannot guarantee a stopping hit is not a tactical advantage. It's a liability. It tempts an operator into higher risk, getting close, relying on timing, trusting stealth, without giving certainty that the risk is worth it. On a test range, with still targets and clean conditions, the Flying Dragon does what it was built to do. Quiet shot, no flash, no casing, almost no trace. But war is not a test range. War is chaos. War is targets that turn at the wrong second because they heard a footstep or saw a shadow. War is clothing that changes with weather and season. War is the difference between a weapon that works 99 times out of 100 and the one time it fails. And an operative dies because he trusted a tool that couldn't deliver its promise. A silent weapon that can't afford a second chance. A silent weapon that can't afford a second chance. And that single-shot limit exposes the deeper problem with the Flying Dragon, the gap between what it was built to do on paper and what it could actually do in the field. On paper, the requirements look clean. The Office of Strategic Services wants a weapon that can remove a target at close range without alerting guards or civilians. They want something you can conceal, something that doesn't look like a normal firearm, something that leaves almost no forensic trail. The Flying Dragon checks those boxes, but paper specs don't include the ugly parts: human bodies, weather, clothing, and the chaos of real operations. Start with range. The ideal distance for the SAC-46 is close, very close, within about 5 meters, ideally less. At that range, the dart can have enough speed to push through light clothing and skin. At that range, the shooter can aim with reasonable confidence that the dart will land somewhere on the torso or the neck. But 5 meters is intimate distance, close enough to see pores and fear, close enough to hear breathing, close enough that if the target turns, if he senses movement or hears a tiny scuff, he can close the space in under 2 seconds. And this weapon isn't forgiving. The dart doesn't hit with bullet force. It isn't meant to break the body through impact. It's meant to deliver poison. That means the dart has to do 2 jobs at once: penetrate and deliver. It needs exposed skin, or at least thin fabric it can punch through so the hollow tip can release its payload into tissue. A shot to the leg might work, if the poison is strong enough and if the dart bites deep enough. A shot to the arm might work, if it hits the right place, maybe near a major vessel. But the chest, where most people aim on instinct, is also where clothing is often thickest. Coats, uniform jackets, layered fabric, heavy wool. So the shooter can't just point and shoot. He has to choose the moment. He has to wait for an angle. He has to hope for an exposed neck, a thin shirt, a clean path. And that kind of precision takes time. Time to aim, time to steady, time to make sure the shot lands where it needs to land. But time is exactly what a covert operative rarely has, especially when the target can turn, move, or notice something wrong. Now add the environment. The dart is light. Compared to a bullet, it's aerodynamically fragile. A small crosswind can push it off course. In a tight hallway, maybe that doesn't matter. But in a street, a courtyard, any open space with moving air, The dart's path starts to feel unpredictable. Temperature matters too. Cold weather drops carbon dioxide pressure. Less pressure means less speed. Less speed means less penetration. The effective range shrinks. In hard winter conditions, common in Northern Europe, the weapon can become unreliable at the exact moment it has to be perfect. Humidity adds its own risk. Plastic can warp. Seals can degrade. Moisture can interfere with how the dart fits, and it can threaten whatever liquid payload is stored in the hollow tip. These aren't lab worries. These are the kind of small failures that happen in real missions, in real streets, with real consequences. And then there's the accuracy problem. A normal pistol, even a cheap one, can hit a human-sized target at 15 to 20 meters with decent consistency. The bullet is dense. It resists wind better. Gravity affects it less over short distances. A shooter can practice, build muscle memory, learn recoil, learn trigger pull. But the Flying Dragon has no real recoil, and that sounds like a good thing, until you realize it means you lose familiar feedback. Even worse, the trigger feel can change depending on how much pressure is left in the carbon dioxide cartridge and how the valve behaves that shot. The dart doesn't fly like a bullet. It can arc, drift, and slow fast. So, the weapon is almost impossible to zero like a normal gun. You can't train on it the same way because each shot can behave slightly differently depending on the temperature, air pressure, and how much gas remains. You are always partly guessing. An educated guess, yes, trained hands, experience, practice, but still a guess. And in a life or death moment where the margin of error is basically zero, a guess is not enough. The dream spec was this: a weapon that could quietly remove a target from across a room, reload fast, and reliably hit what the shooter aimed at. The reality is this: a weapon that works best at conversational distance, takes precious seconds to reload, and needs near-perfect conditions and a target who isn't moving too much. The Dragon is quiet. Almost unbelievably quiet. Later testing in July 1945 would confirm that. Around 69 decibels, barely louder than normal speech, quieter than a cough in a still room. But quiet does not mean effective. Quiet does not cancel a dart drifting in wind. Quiet does not speed up poison inside a human body. Quiet does not give you a second chance if the dart misses, or hits cloth and fails to penetrate, or lands wrong and doesn't deliver the payload. The Flying Dragon achieves its main goal: silence. No muzzle flash, no shell casing, almost no obvious trace. In a technical sense, it really is an invisible weapon. But invisibility only matters if the weapon actually stops the target. And that is the price the Office of Strategic Services can't afford to pay. Because accuracy and stopping power aren't optional extras. They are the foundation of any weapon's usefulness. And the Flying Dragon, brilliant, strange, and clever, sacrifices both in pursuit of one single thing. It is a weapon built around one talent: silence, at the expense of almost everything else. And out in the real world, where lives hang on reliability, that trade is unacceptable. And in the field, where lives depend on reliability, that trade-off is unacceptable. But before the Flying Dragon can be accepted or rejected for real operational use, it has to be judged the only way these programs ever get judged: by testing. Not by theory, not by what the engineers believe it can do, by measured results, under controlled conditions, compared against other tools that might solve the same problem. July 1945. Somewhere in the United States, the exact location is not in public records, or at least not released. A group of OSS evaluators gathers for comparative trials. The goal is blunt. Find out which silent weapons are truly usable for covert work, and which are just expensive experiments wearing a serious face. The Flying Dragon is only one candidate. Also on the line: suppressed pistols, crossbows, other prototype pneumatic systems. Each weapon is fired again and again. Sound levels are measured with proper equipment. Accuracy is checked at different distances. Reliability is logged. Reload time is timed. And at the end, the evaluators will recommend what stays in the kit and what gets quietly shelved. This is not a publicity show. No cameras, no reporters, no morale posters, no propaganda angle. It's an internal check by people who need the truth, because operatives in the field will pay for every lie with blood. The room is plain and clinical. Boards on stands act as backstops. Clipboards and pencils are passed around. Men in civilian clothes and uniforms move between stations, watching, writing, murmuring in low voices. Nobody is here to be impressed. There's tension anyway. Everyone knows some of these devices represent years of work, big spending, and the pride of people who thought they were solving an impossible problem. But pride has no seat at this table, only performance. The Flying Dragon is loaded. A dart is seated carefully in the barrel. The carbon dioxide cartridge is checked. The weapon is raised and aimed at a target about 5 meters away. The trigger is pulled, a soft hiss. The dart moves and hits the board, embedding itself. Barely, but enough to count. At this range, with no wind and no chaos, it behaves like it was designed to behave. Sound measurement, about 69 decibels. For context, normal conversation sits around 60 to 70 decibels. The sound is closer to a quiet appliance in the next room than to what people imagine when they hear gun. In a building with traffic noise, footsteps, and voices, it would be hard to even recognize that a weapon was fired. That part is real. That part is impressive. Then the crossbow goes up. Same range, same target. Bolt loaded, string drawn back, trigger released. You hear the creak, the snap, the whisper of the bolt, nothing more. It reads around 66 decibels, quieter than the Flying Dragon, not by much. The difference is small, almost the kind of difference you'd argue about if you were trying to protect a project. But the meter doesn't care about feelings. It records what it records. And then comes the bigger problem, impact. The crossbow bolt hits with far more physical force. It digs in deeper. It doesn't need chemistry to finish the job. A solid hit to the chest or throat can incapacitate immediately, whether the tip is treated with anything or not. The evaluators write it down. They don't need to say it out loud. The meaning hangs in the air on its own. If silence is the main goal and reliability also matters, then an old crossbow outperforms the cutting-edge pneumatic dart gun in the same room, at the same distance. More tests follow. The Flying Dragon is fired again at longer ranges, 7 meters, then 10. Accuracy starts to fall off. Darts that should land center mass strike wide, strike low, or fail to stick with enough force to stay embedded in the backing. Then they time the reload. Even under ideal conditions, good light, calm hands, no pressure, it takes about 15 to 20 seconds to reload safely and correctly. In a real encounter, that is forever. That is enough time for a target to cross a room, draw a weapon, shout for help, or disappear into a crowd. Then they look at consistency. Carbon dioxide cartridges are tested for pressure variation. Some behave well. Others show differences that change dart velocity in ways the shooter can't fully predict. A weapon that changes its feel from shot to shot is a weapon that turns training into guesswork. Cold conditions are tested too. In a chilled environment, gas pressure drops. Dart speed drops with it. At a certain point, darts barely leave the barrel with meaningful force. By the end of the trials, the verdict becomes unavoidable. For silence alone, the Flying Dragon is near the top. It produces almost no sound. It has no muzzle flash. It leaves no shell casing. On those narrow metrics, it shines. But on the things that keep an operative alive, it sinks. Accuracy, poor beyond very close range. Stopping power, dependent on poison with almost no physical backup. Reliability, vulnerable to weather and cartridge inconsistency. Reload speed, too slow when seconds decide survival. Ease of use, demands precision and calm that real operations rarely allow. The evaluators don't have to debate it for hours. The numbers already made the argument. You can't trust your life to a weapon that only works under perfect conditions. You can't deploy a tool that needs the target to be still, lightly clothed, inside a tight distance window, and conveniently alone, while you spend 20 seconds reloading. And you can't justify continued investment in a device that is outperformed, on silence and on stopping effect, by a weapon design older than modern firearms. The Flying Dragon is quiet. Remarkably quiet. But quiet does not mean good, and in war, good enough is not the phrase that saves lives. And in war, good enough is not a phrase that saves lives. But the July 1945 test results arrived too late to change anything. By the time evaluators are writing their notes, by the time recommendations are drafted and filed, the war that created the need for the Flying Dragon is already ending, if it hasn't ended already. Germany surrenders on May 8, 1945. The Nazi occupation of Europe collapses. Resistance networks step out of the shadows. The covert city war, the war of forged papers, midnight meetings, quiet killings, and desperate luck, stops being the main fight, which means the operational window for the Flying Dragon is closing fast. But that doesn't automatically mean the weapon was never deployed. It only means we have no confirmed record that it was used. And those are two very different statements. Go back to February 1945. An operational request comes in. Someone in the field asks for the pneumatic dart gun by name. The Office of Strategic Services reacts. Units are prepared, darts are manufactured, the weapon enters the supply chain and disappears into classified channels. What happens next is a blank page. The operative who requested it may have carried it into a mission. He may have hidden it under a coat, walked into an occupied city, identified a target, and decided to use it. Or he may have decided at the last second that the risk was too high, that a suppressed pistol, even if louder, was still more dependable than a dart gun that might fail at the 1 second that matters most. We don't know, because covert operations aren't documented like conventional battles. There aren't neat after-action reports with maps and unit stamps. There aren't clean lines that say, on this date, at this place, Operative X used weapon Y to eliminate target Z. Especially not when the job is assassination. Especially not when the target is a civilian collaborator, an informant, or someone whose death needs to look like nothing happened at all. If the Flying Dragon was used successfully, the success would be silence itself. A body found hours later. No witnesses, no gunshot, no obvious crime scene, just a tiny puncture mark that could be dismissed as a scratch, a sting, or an unexplained spot that doctors in 1945, without modern tools, might struggle to interpret. But if it failed, we might never hear about that either. Operatives who fail behind enemy lines don't write a report the next day. They get captured, they get interrogated, they get executed, their networks get rolled up, their contacts get arrested, and the weapons they carried get seized, studied, and either destroyed or buried inside enemy archives that remain sealed. So, the absence of documentation proves almost nothing. What we can say is narrower but solid. Between February and June 1945, the Flying Dragon exists as an operational tool. It is built, issued through channels, and likely carried by at least one person who believed it might be needed for a specific job. Then, the world changes again. In August 1945, the war in the Pacific ends. Japan surrenders. The global conflict that began in 1939 is over, and with it, the urgency that fuels strange experimental weapons evaporates almost overnight. The Office of Strategic Services doesn't survive peace. In October 1945, only weeks after Japan's surrender, President Truman disbands the organization. Its functions get split and absorbed elsewhere. Its records scatter. Its people return to civilian life, move into new intelligence services, or vanish into the quiet machinery of post-war government. And the Flying Dragon becomes a relic. Not because it failed in combat, not because it was crushed by battlefield reality, but because the battlefield it was designed for no longer exists. This weapon was built for occupation war, urban resistance work, situations where one silent hit could change a mission without waking the building or pulling a patrol down the street. But by the time the tool is ready to spread wider, the cities are liberated, the occupiers are dead, captured, or running. The resistance is either mourning, celebrated, or shifting into new roles in governments being rebuilt across Europe. There is no longer a daily need for a weapon that can remove a Gestapo officer in a Paris cafe without anyone noticing. So, the Flying Dragon is inventoried, cataloged, and stored. Post-war records suggest the Americans still held about a dozen SAC-46 pistols and around 1,000 darts after testing and any limited issue that may have happened. The exact numbers vary by source, and some files remain missing or locked away, but the picture is consistent. Most of these weapons were never used outside controlled settings. They sit in boxes, in warehouses, in storage rooms that later transfer to successor agencies as the United States reorganizes for the Cold War, and the people who might have carried them. The ones who might have a story where the flying dragon saved them or failed and almost got them killed, never talk publicly. Because that's how intelligence work lives. Success is invisible. Failure is buried. And the truth stays behind classification walls that may not come down for decades, if they ever come down at all. So, we're left with questions. Was the flying dragon ever fired in anger? Did it ever eliminate a target in the field? Did it save a mission or ruin one? Or did it exist in that strange in-between state, built, shipped, carried, but never actually used? Maybe the mission that could have justified it was canceled. Maybe it was done with a different weapon. Maybe it was compromised before it could even begin. We don't know, and the silence that defined the weapon's design now defines its history. No confirmed wartime field use is documented. No memoirs brag about it. No declassified report tells a clean success story. The flying dragon remains what it was built to be, a weapon meant to be invisible, and so invisible that even its use, if it ever happened, is still hidden today. The flying dragon ends up in the historical record as a curiosity, a footnote, a weapon built to be invisible, and so invisible that even its use, if it ever happened, stays invisible to this day. But before the SAC-46 fades all the way into obscurity, there is one last attempt to rescue the concept, one final iteration, a modification so strange and so ambitious that it makes the original flying dragon look almost cautious by comparison, the missile dart. Somewhere late in the development run, likely late 1944 or early 1945, someone proposes a radical change to the projectile itself. The problem with the original system is clear. The dart depends on the carbon dioxide cartridge in the weapon for all its push. Once it leaves the barrel, it becomes a passive object. It coasts, it slows, it becomes a victim of wind and gravity almost immediately. So, the question shifts from, how do we build a better launcher, to something wilder. What if the dart carried its own propellant? What if, instead of a hollow plastic needle pushed by gas from the weapon, the projectile was built around a tiny carbon dioxide cartridge of its own, self-contained, self-powered, a miniature rocket in effect, a dart that keeps accelerating after it leaves the barrel. On paper, that solves several problems at once. It extends range because the dart wouldn't bleed speed as quickly if it's still being driven during flight. It boosts penetration because more speed means more impact energy, which means a better chance of punching through heavier clothing and embedding deeper in tissue. And it could improve accuracy because a powered dart can use stabilizing fins more effectively when it's moving fast and staying stable longer. The concept is documented. Designs are drawn. Prototypes may have been built. Records here are thin and fragmentary, but the idea itself clearly exists as more than a casual sketch. But the missile dart never makes it past the experimental stage, because it introduces more problems than it fixes. First, complexity. A dart with its own propellant isn't a simple plastic projectile anymore. It becomes a precision device. It has to be manufactured to tighter tolerances. It has to be sealed so gas doesn't leak. It has to work the same way every time, because a partial release or a mid-flight failure could make the dart tumble and veer unpredictably. Second, cost. A self-propelled dart is dramatically more expensive than a hollow plastic needle, and this weapon is already niche, already limited. Adding serious cost makes it even harder to justify in any real program that has to produce, store, and supply the parts. Third, safety. A dart carrying its own pressurized cartridge becomes a small high-pressure hazard. Drop it, crush it, mishandle it. It can rupture. Now, imagine an operative carrying dozens of these in a pocket or a pouch. Imagine a fall, a struggle, a hard sprint into a wall, a door slammed at the wrong second. That risk alone is enough to kill the idea. And fourth, and this is the fatal point, the original problem still doesn't go away. Even a faster dart, even a dart that penetrates better, still depends on poison to stop the target fast enough. The missile dart does not make poison act quicker inside the human body. It does not erase the risk that a target stays on his feet long enough to shout, draw a weapon, or bring guards running. So, the missile dart dies on the bench. It becomes a prototype, a note in a folder, an idea that looks brilliant on a drawing board and collapses under the weight of practical reality. And with it, the last serious push to make the flying dragon concept truly viable ends. Because by this point, the engineers and evaluators understand something painful. The weapon isn't failing because it needs more range. It isn't failing because it needs more penetration. It isn't failing because of a simple mechanical limitation that can be fixed with better parts. It's failing because the core idea, a silent dart gun that depends on poison to stop a human being, doesn't match real operations. So, what happens to a weapon that is brilliant on paper and useless when it counts? So what happens to a weapon that is brilliant on paper and useless when it counts? It gets counted. It gets boxed. And then it gets forgotten. October 1945. The Office of Strategic Services is officially dissolved. President Truman signs the order. The wartime intelligence machine that worked in shadows across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific is broken apart. People are reassigned, retired, or absorbed into other offices. Records are stamped, classified, and filed away. Equipment is inventoried, and in that inventory, buried among thousands of other items, sit the leftovers of the Flying Dragon program: radios, cameras, lock-picking tools, forged papers, explosives, weapons of every shape you can imagine. And somewhere in that ocean of gear, the SAC-46. The numbers are precise, clinical, almost insulting in how ordinary they feel. About 12 SAC-46 pistols still in storage, around 1,000 darts, some loaded, some not, an unspecified number of carbon dioxide cartridges, manuals, design drawings, test reports from the July 1945 trials. Everything is counted, everything is tagged, everything is sealed into crates and moved to secure storage where it can sit for years without anyone asking to see it. No ceremony, no speech, no "we did it." No public credit for the engineers who worked out silent propulsion, or the chemists who wrestled with the poison problem, or the operatives who may have carried the thing into a real city, knowing it could be the difference between escape and a prison cell. Just paperwork, forms filled out again and again, a line in a ledger. The Flying Dragon becomes a number in a system, a storage tag on a crate, a weapon that still exists technically, but no longer matters to anyone who is making decisions. Because the world has moved on. The first post-war years are messy and loud. Governments are being rebuilt. Trials are underway. Millions of displaced people are moving across borders. Economies are broken. Cities are still smoking ruins. Military leaders and politicians are staring at the next problem, not the last one. No one is thinking about experimental dart guns. No one is asking whether the Flying Dragon should be refined, improved, or issued for future conflicts. So it sits, quiet, unnoticed, exactly as it was designed to be. You can almost see the storage scene without trying: dim rooms lined with metal shelves, wooden crates stacked floor to ceiling, stenciled codes on the sides, contents, origin, classification, dust collecting in the corners, the smell of old wood, oil, and faint chemicals slowly aging in the dark. Somewhere in one of those crates is a SAC-46, rough welded tubing for a frame, a barrel that looks too long for anything meant to hide under a coat, the carbon dioxide housing tucked beneath it, a crude grip that never quite feels right in a human hand. Even now, it looks like something made in a garage, like a prototype that escaped the workshop, like a tool built by someone who understood pressure and valves but didn't care whether it felt like a real pistol. And in a way, that's exactly what it is. The Flying Dragon was never meant to be pretty. It wasn't meant to be comfortable, elegant, or confidence-inspiring. It was built to solve one problem: how to hit a man without making a sound. And in that narrow sense, it succeeds. But winning one metric does not make a weapon practical, so it stays in the dark, waiting for a purpose that never comes. The war it was built for is over. The missions it might have served are completed, canceled, or lost to sealed files. The people who could have relied on it have moved on to other work, returned to civilian life, or died in operations that had nothing to do with silent dart guns. The Flying Dragon becomes obsolete before it ever gets a real chance to prove itself. And in the decades that follow, that is what it remains: a relic of a war that ended before the weapon could ever find its moment. And in the decades that follow, it remains exactly that, a relic of a war that ended before the weapon could find its moment. But the story of the Flying Dragon isn't just about a strange weapon that never gets wide use. It's about a lesson intelligence agencies have to learn again and again, sometimes the hard way, over the decades that follow. Silence is only step one. A weapon that doesn't wait guards is useless if the target can still scream. A weapon that leaves no forensic trail is meaningless if the mission collapses because the target survives long enough to identify the attacker. A weapon that fires with no flash and no bang is just an expensive curiosity if it can't guarantee the only thing that matters in a covert job: the target goes down and stays down. The Flying Dragon solves the silence problem. It solves concealment. It reduces the obvious crime scene clues. But it cannot solve the lethality problem, and that is the whole game. Because the weapon's effectiveness depends almost entirely on what's inside the hollow tip of the dart. Not on raw impact, not on the kind of muscle memory you can train into a shooter, not on recoil control or quick follow-up shots, on chemistry, on a substance that has to work fast enough and reliably enough to stop a human being in the seconds between feeling the hit and reacting to it. And there is no perfect poison that meets all the demands at once. Poisons that act fast tend to be easier to detect, more dangerous to handle, or less stable in storage. Poisons that are hard to detect tend to act too slowly. Poisons that are easy to make tend to be unreliable. Poisons that work on most people can still fail on others because bodies aren't identical. Weight, metabolism, and tolerance can all change outcomes. That's the impossible equation, and the engineers understand it. The evaluators understand it. The operatives asked to carry the weapon understand it too. Which is why, when an operative has a choice between the Flying Dragon and a suppressed pistol, something loud enough to carry through a door, but dependable enough to stop a target with a single hit, most choose the pistol. Because in the end, reliability matters more than silence. A loud weapon that works is better than a silent weapon that might work. A weapon that leaves evidence but completes the mission is better than a weapon that leaves no trace while the target escapes, raises the alarm, and burns the whole network to the ground. That is the hard truth the Flying Dragon represents. Innovation isn't enough. Cleverness isn't enough. Solving one problem brilliantly doesn't matter if you can't solve the problems that come after. The poison question was always the center of everything. The entire design lives or dies on it, and the project stalls because there's no clean answer. You can build a silent launcher. You can design a dart that flies straight and bites through fabric. You can shrink the system, hide it under clothing, make it almost invisible. But you can't make the poison act with the speed and certainty the mission demands. And without that final piece, without chemical certainty that a hit becomes rapid incapacitation, the weapon is just a gamble. A gamble that asks an operative to get within 5 meters of a target, fire a single shot from a weapon that can't be quickly reloaded, and trust a chain of ifs if the dart hits. If it penetrates, if the payload releases, if the poison works fast enough, if the target collapses before he can shout, draw a weapon, or fight back. That's not a tactical tool, that's a prayer wrapped in metal and plastic. And intelligence services do not build missions around prayers. So, the Flying Dragon is set aside. Not because the mechanics don't function, not because the concept is childish, but because the one thing it needs to succeed, a poison that works with the speed and certainty of a bullet, doesn't exist in a form they can trust. And if that piece doesn't exist, then the weapon, no matter how quiet, no matter how clever, is fundamentally incomplete. That's why the poison question was the whole game, and why the game stalls, and why the game stalled. But it did not end, because when the Office of Strategic Services is dissolved in October 1945, the mission does not dissolve with it. The need for intelligence work, sabotage, and quiet killing does not vanish just because parades start and headlines change. CIA. If anything, it gets sharper. The Cold War begins fast. Former allies harden into rivals. New borders appear. New police states rise. The United States learns a brutal lesson. The next fight will not always be tank versus tank. Sometimes it will be rumor versus rumor, spy versus spy. One accident that is not an accident. So, the people in the files move. The Office of Strategic Services is broken apart. Some parts are absorbed into new groups. By January 1946, the Central Intelligence Group exists to coordinate intelligence at the national level, CIA. Then, in 1947, the National Security Act creates the Central Intelligence Agency, turning wartime habits into a peacetime machine, CIA plus one. And inside that machine, one idea refuses to die. Silence still has value, if you can trust it. The SAC-46. Flying Dragon itself is not revived as a standard tool. The actual tubes and darts stay boxed away. But the problem it tried to solve never goes away. How do you remove a person without noise, without flash, and without a clear trail back to the hand that pulled the trigger? So, the research continues, especially around toxins and delivery devices. Not because it is cool, because planners keep imagining the same nightmare. A hallway, a locked door, a guard 2 steps away, and a mission that cannot afford a gunshot. And then, decades later, the public catches a glimpse of that world. In September 1975, during the Senate's Church Committee hearings, a poison dart gun is shown and discussed, so real and so bluntly described that Senator Frank Church calls it a murder instrument. Time plus cease dies. The press gives it a nickname. People argue about what it could do and whether it was ever used. But the point is simpler. The concept is still alive. The dream is still the same. Quiet, deniable, almost invisible violence. Same dream. Same problem. Because the moral weight does not get lighter with better tools. If anything, it gets heavier. The more invisible the act becomes, the more it asks the people behind it to live in a world where success means nobody even knows a weapon existed. And that leaves the final question hanging, then and now. What does it do to the people who design tools meant only for silent killing? But the fundamental question remains, what does it do to the people who design tools meant only for silent killing? That question has no clean answer. No ending that satisfies both operational necessity and moral cost. But the weapon itself, the physical object, the SAC-46, the Flying Dragon, does have a final destination. It ends up behind glass, years after the war, decades perhaps. The exact timeline is unclear, and the documentation is incomplete. But at some point, at least one Flying Dragon is moved from classified storage into a museum collection, one focused on special warfare and the tools used by covert operatives during World War II and beyond. The weapon is put on display, not as a celebrated artifact, not as a triumph of engineering, not as a decisive tool that changed history, but as a curiosity, an oddity, a reminder of what people try to build when the problem feels impossible and the clock won't stop. And if you stood in front of that display case today, this is what you would see. A crude frame, metal tubing welded together with visible seams and rough edges, like it was made quickly and never meant to be admired. The barrel stretches forward, longer than you'd expect for something meant to hide under clothing, making the whole thing look awkward, almost unbalanced. Beneath it, the carbon dioxide housing now empty, a cylindrical space where a cartridge once sat. The grip looks angular and uncomfortable, shaped for function, not for a human hand that has to trust it. The finish is worn, paint is chipped in places, exposing bare metal underneath. Scratches and scuff marks hint at handling, storage, and decades of being moved from one secure room to another without anyone treating it like a treasure. It looks, honestly, like exactly what it is. A weapon that was never meant to be seen. A tool built for a purpose so narrow that comfort and beauty simply did not matter. Next to it, maybe a few darts, red plastic projectiles, their tips now empty of poison, their hollow cores visible if you look closely. They look fragile, almost delicate. It's hard to believe these thin little objects were ever discussed as serious instruments of death. There might be a placard beside the case, a few tight sentences. Technical notes, pneumatic propulsion, carbon dioxide powered, designed from 1943 to 1945, roughly 15 manufactured. Operational use, unconfirmed. That last word carries weight. Unconfirmed, not never used. Not used in these missions, just unconfirmed, leaving the door open. Hinting that the truth might still be classified, that something may have happened, that someone may have carried this into hostile streets and used it in a way that never made it into public files. Or it may mean something simpler, that no one knows, that the records were destroyed, misplaced, or never written down in the first place, that the weapon passed through hands whose names were protected, forgotten, or buried, people whose actions were never meant to survive into history. The museum setting does something important. It pulls the flying dragon out of active secrecy and places it into history. It changes it from a tool into an object, from a hidden asset into a public artifact. But it does not solve the questions the weapon raises. Behind that glass, the SAC-46 still asks, what were we willing to do to win? What compromises felt acceptable in the moment? What did we build, knowing its only purpose was to end a human life in the quietest way possible? The weapon can't answer. It can only sit there, silent, waiting for someone to notice it, read the placard, and wonder what it felt like to carry such a thing into a dark alley in an occupied city. A weapon that looks like a garage tool, behind glass, a relic. A weapon that looks like a garage tool, behind glass, a relic. But relics teach lessons. And the flying dragon, despite its failures, despite its limits, teaches one that still matters long after the program ends. The lesson is simple. You cannot engineer away the moral weight of killing. You can make a weapon quieter. You can remove flash, remove bang, remove the obvious physical trail. You can build a tool so subtle, so nearly invisible, that its use leaves almost nothing behind. But you cannot remove the human choices. One human being chooses to design it, another chooses to carry it, and a third chooses to use it. The flying dragon is an attempt to make violence disappear, to create killing so silent, so clean-looking, it could happen in a crowded place without anyone noticing, to turn assassination into a technical puzzle, propulsion, chemistry, trajectory, timing. And in a narrow sense, it works. It is quiet, it is concealable, it leaves minimal obvious evidence, but it cannot solve the human part. It cannot guarantee the person holding it will choose the right moment or the right target. It cannot guarantee the target is truly guilty of the acts used to justify his death. It cannot guarantee the poison works fast enough, every time, under real conditions. And it cannot guarantee the mission succeeds in a way that makes the moral cost feel worth it. So, the weapon becomes a warning label made of metal and plastic, a reminder that capability does not equal wisdom, a reminder that being able to do something does not mean you should, a reminder that silence is not the same thing as righteousness. The engineers who built the flying dragon were not monsters. They were people trying to solve a brutal problem under brutal conditions, trying to give field operatives a tool that might save their lives, trying to complete missions that could shorten the war, disrupt occupation forces, and prevent greater suffering. But the tool they created still asks a question that goes beyond tactics. How quiet should a man's death be allowed to sound? Because if death can be made completely silent, no alarm, no witnesses, no clear mark beyond a body that looks natural, what stops that tool from being abused? What stops it from being used not on enemy operators, not on war criminals, not on targets who pose an immediate threat, but on dissidents, on journalists, on anyone who becomes inconvenient to the people who control the weapon? The flying dragon did not change the war. By the time it is ready, the war is already ending. The missions it was built for are complete, obsolete, or canceled. But it changes the question. It forces intelligence agencies, engineers, and policymakers to face an uncomfortable reality. Some capabilities carry costs you cannot measure with mission success or operational efficiency. The ability to kill invisibly is not just a technical achievement. It is a moral threshold, and once you cross it, stepping back is hard. The SAC-46 sits in a museum now, an odd-looking device with a long barrel and a crude frame, a tool that never works the way its designers wanted. But its legacy isn't the missions it completed. Its legacy is the questions it leaves behind. Questions about silence and violence, about invisibility and accountability, about the gap between what we can build and what we should build. And those questions do not stay behind glass. They follow us into the Cold War, into the modern era, into every lab where someone designs the next clean tool, the next device that promises violence will be quieter, neater, more deniable. The flying dragon asks, What is the cost of making death invisible? And the answer is that invisibility has a cost of its own, not measured in decibels or dollars. Measured in the slow erosion of boundaries, the lines that separate necessary force from casual violence, legitimate operations from political murder, war from assassination. In the end, the flying dragon didn't fail because it was too loud. It failed because silence alone was never enough.